Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this learning event that TIPS is hosting on Sector Jobs Resilience Plan research. This is the fourth learning event that we've held, and today's event we're looking at going into what we've been calling deep dives into some of the more nuanced and very relevant issues that are coming through from the research that we've done, both in the National Employment Vulnerability Assessments and in the Sector Jobs Resilience Plans. What we have seen is, as we've been exploring these five different sectors that we've done research on, which is coal, petroleum-based transport, tourism, metals, and agriculture, that some of the outcomes were worthy of doing a bit more research and understanding so that we can better explore and understand the challenges that we're facing as well as the opportunities that will emerge. All of these papers are available on the TIPS website. So both the employment vulnerability assessments, the sector jobs resilience plans, which were updated from the ones we did in 2021, and now all of these deep dive papers, as well as the overview report. So today we've got quite a long session, which is going to start off with Dr. Neva Machetla presenting the project overview. And then we're going to go into presentations from Michael Hector, Kate Rivet-Karnak, Akona Miatanza, Gillian Chigumira, and then we have our discussant, Dr. Ariel Prinsloo, who's going to share some of her insights into some of the issues that emerge from her review of this work. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I didn't introduce myself, so those who can see my name, I'm Saul Levin from TIPS, and I'll be moderating today's session. We are purely online. We often do have these events as hybrid, and today we chose to try just doing it as a virtual seminar, and we look forward to your engagement and comments along the way, as well as your questions at question time. So feel free to type comments in the inbox, and then we'll have all the presentations, the discussant, and then we'll open up for Q&A after that. So let me turn over to our first presenter, Neva Machetla from TIPS, who is one of our senior economists. Neva, good morning, and over to you to present. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I just have to, guess what, figure out how to share. Okay, so this is really just an overview of what the whole project's trying to achieve. It's sort of like the executive summary for the project. And also we've learned some things since the last round, which I think it's also trying to show. So what the report does is it identifies some key cross-cutting elements for the SJRP. In effect, it says this is the methodology that we used, which could then be applied to other industries as well, but also updated. And so particularly it looks at the aims and the scope of the SJRPs, the core strategies, the structural challenges to implementation, and some of the main next steps. And as you know, I think if you've been here before, we really focused on what we saw as the most affected value chains, which is the coal value chain, auto, agriculture, tourism, and metals. And the paper also has an annexure that provides a table that summarizes the key initiatives for each value chain. So the aims of this whole project is to say, how do we minimize harm to vulnerable people, given that there will be inevitable changes at industry and value chain level? And those impacts are both policy-induced, that is, policies that are aimed to reduce emissions, both at national level, but also by foreign partners, particularly trading partners and sources of finance, but also direct through the weather. And obviously, everybody will be affected by both to some extent. We're trying to say, how do we then strategically say where are the worst impacts likely to be, and how do we then ensure that those are dealt with more appropriately? And what we mean by vulnerable people is that it's groups in the most affected industries that largely lack the resources to adapt, which in practice means workers, small businesses, and their communities. And to be clear about the communities issues, in some industries are very highly concentrated in a few areas. Others, like agriculture, are all over the rural areas, but some areas may be more affected than others. And others, like petrol retail, are you can't really define a geographic concentration at all. But this kind of approach is particularly important because South Africa has a very odd combination of unusually deep economic inequality, some of the worst in the world, but also a genuine political democracy. And that means that, firstly, just politically and socially, if you want to build a coalition for change, you have to keep the majority on board. But also the inequalities mean that some people will, in fact, be much worse hit than others. So just to be clear what it isn't, because honestly, this can be extremely broad or extremely narrow. Firstly, we're saying it's not about the transformation of the entire economy or even the value chain. So we're not saying this is the development strategy for the value chain. We're saying, what do we have to do to deal with the impacts of climate change in particular, not necessarily what is our ideal end state for the value chain. And secondly, we're saying it has to derive from the specific problem solving for the affected industries and the stakeholders that will be most affected, not from abstract principles of justice, so that we don't end up just continuously fighting about abstractions, but also because the aim is to solve a problem. And, strong policy typically has to, really be fairly focused. The second thing that comes up is that really the problem with the SJRPs, and this is something I think we've learned over the last 5 years in particular, is that we're dealing with uncertainty. It's one of those big planning challenges where we know there will be severe impacts, but we don't really know when they're going to hit and where they're going to hit in great detail. And as you know, the projections even contradict each other. So what that means is you need a response that says, particularly focuses on how do we strengthen capacity of government agencies and stakeholders at the industry level to improve our understanding of likely impacts in the industry over time, to initiate action now that can minimize those impacts where it's possible, and where the impacts can't be prevented, to ensure that there are systems in place to support vulnerable groups. And what comes up, it's like, actually, it's analogous to how we deal with any disasters, or in fact, something like public health, where you're saying we need to say, what can we do now to limit the damage caused by future emergencies? But also, how do we ensure that when required, when those emergencies hit, we have the resources, institutional capacity, and templates for effective responses in place so that we can respond more effectively without having to start, afresh each time. The core strategies are then to say who are the affected groups and their resources. So that means saying what are the industries and value chains that will be most affected by climate change, again, both directly and through policy industries impacts, and what resource do they have? And that can be economic in terms of assets or income. That can be what are their qualifications, which enable them to find other livelihoods, and their experience. That can be social in terms of what social groups are they part of? Are they organized? Do they have representative organizations? Do they participate in elections? Those kinds of issues as well. The second thing, again, is to say, how do we build institutional capacity to respond? And I have to say, I would argue at this point, that's probably the most important thing we can do. The third one is technological mitigation, which is to say, what can we do technologically to reduce the impacts of climate change on the industry? So that would be things like in agriculture, coming up with farming techniques that are more resistant to heat, heavy downpours, flooding, all of the things we know climate change will bring. But also just to forecast things better in advance so that farmers can adapt. Second substantive pillar is economic diversification in the most affected regions. Obviously, we want this for the economy as a whole, but it's particularly important where you have regions that are deeply dependent on an industry that will be heavily affected by climate change. And that means obviously the coal mines, but also there's tourism areas, there are farming areas that will be more affected. Some of those are easier to identify than others. The third pillar on the substantive side is active labor market policies, which is to say, how do we enable these affected groups? So it's not saying everybody, but it's particularly groups that will have a hard time finding new livelihoods. How do we support them to find new livelihoods, whether it's helping them with job search, with training, with initial finance for small business? In some cases, it may mean even supporting migration away, like so farm workers, if a farm closes down, typically have to move someplace else. And then finally, there's social protection, because even with active labor market policies, even with diversification, as a minimum, it takes months, it can take years for people to find new livelihoods, new ways to live in a different industry. And they need to be protected in that period, or you can end up with a much worse situation where they never actually get into a better situation. So the main challenges to the implementation, I think what comes up very clearly is that the really biggest challenges is we are balancing the future needs against very important trade-offs in the present. So, we all know the situation we're in as a country. With our deep inequalities in particular, there's a huge demands on government to deliver, and also for the economy and for infrastructure. And then we're saying, but there's also this future need. So we have to figure out how to meet those future needs, and how do we get that balance right? This is always difficult. I would argue that there's a risk that we shouldn't say, there's a temptation to say, let's overstate the terrible impacts that could happen so that we can convince people to mobilize the resources we need. And experience shows it doesn't work. Firstly, nobody likes being scared. It's something they learned with the HIV campaign. You don't get people to move by trying to scare them. But the second thing is you get pushback when the impacts don't happen immediately. And particularly, you can get real pushback against policies that are designed to reduce emissions. So I think we have to be quite careful about how we frame this kind of initiative. In that context, the problem is that the process arrives from the climate change white paper, but it's not actually in the new act. And also the responsibilities are split between departments and spheres. So, on the economic side, the DTIC has the lead role. Funding is obviously Treasury. Overall environmental response is environmental affairs. Managing those different mandates also through the spheres is difficult, obviously. And just to be clear, the Climate Change Act does say there should be sectoral responses, but it doesn't talk specifically about, employment issues. It defines responsibilities in terms of what sectors like agriculture and manufacturing, not industries or value chains. It's clear when you read the thing, it's really focused on extreme weather events, but not downsizing as we try to reduce emissions. And it doesn't, it says we should ensure just outcomes, but it doesn't really say how do we think about support for vulnerable groups within value chains. Because remember, on a national level, some of those groups are not the poorest of the poor. They're often formal workers who historically have been not in the poorest 30% of the population. So what are the next steps that we come out of this analysis? Firstly, we really, again, there's a big information problem here. We need stronger monitoring and forecasting of the weather, but also of the policy and effects. So when we do a carbon tax or whatever, we need to be very clear about the likely impacts. And similarly, when our partners are changing policies, we should understand that as well. But we also need to say, how do we improve communication with stakeholders? So for instance, if we think there's going to be a localized drought, we're very bad at forecasting it, and we're not very good at communicating it to the affected communities. So how do we think about both of those issues as something we can do now that will improve all of our responses going forward? The second thing is to think about technological fixes, because if we start now to introduce those mitigating technologies, we can prevent or at least reduce the worst outcomes of the climate change. But we do have to say now, and this is where the SJRP, I think, can play a role, how do we not only promote their adoption, but ensure that they avoid disadvantaging working people in their communities, and in fact, ideally leave them with better off than before? So it doesn't help to introduce new technologies in agriculture from the point of view of farm workers if it just means they all lose their jobs because they can't deal with the digital technology. We need to start now to talk about local economic diversification away from the hardest hit industries where that's possible, which above all means assisting municipalities to develop plans. We all know that outside of the metros, and even in some metros, municipalities are very stretched when it comes to resources for planning and development, and it's not really clear I mean, part of that is because it's not clear from the Constitution, what is their mandate in this process? So we have to talk about who's going to pay for this. So it's not just an unfunded mandate. And what is the mandate of the provinces and local government in terms of the Constitution as well as the various legislations? And then finally, and again, I would argue most important now is institution building that can drive these processes, which means we need systems that can sustain effective and expanding responses over time as the crisis becomes worse, that can draw on capacity and funds as they need them in future in a way that is not excessively costly for the present. So ideally, you have something like an insurance system where the funding is there, but you're not necessarily locking it into use now when you don't need it. And I would argue that the first step is, again, given divided mandates and responsibilities in government, we need a clear platform that can take the process forward. There are some structures set up in the Act, but again, it doesn't specifically deal with SJRPs. And what you need is to say, how do we think about specifically on the economy that we have collaboration and decision-making? And I mean, as a former official, I would say clear dispute settlement mechanisms that don't last forever so that we can make progress. But over time, we need to think is how do we drive development of decision-making systems that empower the affected working people in their communities? Because as we all know, we have inherited a top-down bureaucracy. It's dysfunctional, particularly in delivering on the ground. So we need to think clearly about what kind of systems will empower people to utilize the tools that we're providing through the SJRP as they need them. And a particular part of that would be to review the existing active labor market policies and social protection systems to say, how do we make them not only better functional and adequately resourced and targeted towards the kinds of impacts we're talking about, but also more responsive to the needs of working people in their communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neva. I think that gives everyone a good overview of some of the key challenges that we're facing with thinking through some of the impacts of climate change and the decisions that are being taken around responses to climate change. And the paper, I've just shared the link of all the papers, but the paper does give quite a strong summary of all the key issues, as well as a table at the end, which summarizes some of the key recommendations. So thank you very much, Neva. We now move on to our next presentation from Dr. Michael Hector, who is one of our economists at TIPS. He's going to be presenting his paper on farm labor and climate change in South Africa, assessing the role of active labor market policies. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Saul. Hope everyone can hear me clearly.
We can hear you. You just need, yeah, and we can see your presentation. Thank you.
There we go. Everything looks good. Okay, thanks. Morning, everyone. So I'll be doing the presentation on the deep dive on active labor market policies, specifically as they relate to farm labor and climate change. So just a bit of a background on the deep dive on ALMPs and farm labor. So this is essentially an extension of the Agri-SGRP paper and does further research on ALMPs within the context of climate change, but specifically as they relate to farm workers. So in brief, some of the findings show that although the sector supports around 840,000 jobs and is very much an important economic activity within many agri-dependent municipalities in South Africa, we still find that farm workers remain very much vulnerable within the labor market and tend to be in a very precarious position. With their work often being seasonal, wages being low, things like access to social protection and worker representation also being low, but then also skills development being very much limited. And a lot of this is structural challenges that have been inherited from apartheid era legacies that are now worsening and intensifying as a result of climate change. We see more frequent droughts, more frequent floods, which directly impact labor demand and then also income stability. As a whole, we see ALMPs in South Africa, they tend to offer a short-term relief, but have very limited long-term employment benefits. These programs are often found to be fragmented, weakly coordinated, issues with implementation, and in the context of this paper, they are not aligned with climate-related disruptions, especially within the agricultural sector. So for those who have been present throughout this series of presentations and the work that we've been presenting on the vulnerability assessments and then also the SGRPs, you will already know that farm workers are in a precarious position. We see low skills levels, low pay, weak social protection, and so forth. And research shows that unlike formal workers in other sectors outside of agriculture, farm workers have limited access to resources, including opportunities for skills development and career progression. So in terms of climate change and farm labor, the impact of climate change is very much twofold within the sector. So climate change directly impacts farm workers, whether this be through health impacts, things like heat stress, for example, but then also adaptation technologies, which could risk their jobs, things like mechanization, automation, and so forth. So while these measures may stabilize output and employment, things like automation, as mentioned before, tend to reduce demand for low-skilled manual labor, particularly seasonal and temporary workers. So we see that in this event, we see that technological change tends to increase the demand for more skilled, technically competent workers, while the majority of the farm workers, as the vulnerability assessment showed, a lot of them do not have matric and they remain concentrated within the elementary occupation within the agricultural sectors. And this essentially limits their ability to transition to alternative forms of work. Now, in terms of active labor market policies and farm labor, so to recap, the whole purpose of ALMPs is to mitigate short-term losses from becoming long-term unemployment and to assist in effective re-entry into the labor market. Under apartheid, ALMPs were largely limited to white, colored, and Asian workers and focused on training and UIF support, with these high-quality systems essentially serving a very small, skilled minority. Post-1994, we see the sort of expansion of the labor market, but also expansion of ALMPs. However, the delivery capacity was not expanded, which put further pressure on the effectiveness and implementation of ALMPs. So we see very much a fragmented program landscape across various departments within the country, but then also in instances, most recently being TERS during the COVID pandemic, which provides temporary relief during downturns. But these are not designed for long-term employment or labor transitions. So within the context of weak employment within South Africa, LMPs largely function as a short-term relief mechanism rather than providing a reliable pathway into sustained employment. So part of this paper was looking at what would ALMPs look like in the context of climate change, specifically as they relate to farm workers. So one of the key questions that was asked was, why do ALMPs matter for climate adaptation? The predominant answer is that climate shocks essentially risk turning temporary farm employment losses into permanent labor market exit, because climate change may get so bad that farm will have to close down or even reduce hours. So we see a need for very much a climate responsive ALMPs, which should look at sort of stabilizing incomes, maintaining market attachment. But consideration in this case, especially when we look at farm workers, also needs to be made for older workers, workers with low education levels or skill levels, but then also people with disabilities. And in the case of farm workers, we see very much seasonal and informal workers, which tend to be excluded from formal ALMPs. So making social protection essential. So the International Labour Organization identified ALMPs as a core instrument for a just transition, especially when one integrates this with income support and social protection. So the ILO framework essentially looks at what was done during the COVID-19 pandemic to support workers and then also businesses, especially small businesses, and applies the same type of logic to climate change, where there is a sort of combination of social protection and ALMPs. So we see it sort of at a three-tier level where there's support, whether this be income support or skill support during sudden climate shocks like a flood or a drought, but then also taking into consideration the slow onset of environmental change. So asking the question, what if soil erosion or deforestation leads to further job losses? But then also taking into account structural changes within a sector. So when sectors start moving from high carbon to low carbon, so when industries start to shift, when farms, for example, start to adopt rather climate change technologies, what do we do in those cases? So further study is obviously needed in this regard. So I view the ILO, this three-dimensional framework, more as a toolbox of how ALMPs could be more climate responses. Now, the difficulty here, in my opinion, is that we do not know the exact impact of climate change in the future. So planning, therefore, needs to start early. So we need to start thinking about beyond short term, whether this be income support or other support mechanisms, and start looking at what is realistic and what is sustainable in the long term. And this is where the just transition becomes very much important. So what I essentially set out doing was looking at this framework and see how this could be utilized in the context of farm workers, given that we're not only dealing with permanent workers, but also seasonal, and then you also have household level gardening rather. So households, especially in historic labor sending regions, that make use or rely on agriculture as either a supplement to their food or even their income. So what we see is that the value chain is very much complex. So there's not sort of this one silver bullet that is going to cover every single issue, but I try to divide this into a set of pillars. So the first pillar relates to income stabilization and social protection. So we see there's a need for when climate shocks and structural vulnerability that could expose farm workers to long-term unemployment. So we see possible interventions looking at the short term, the medium term, and also the long term, especially when we start looking at older workers who perhaps could not participate in ALMPs. But also we see, especially among farm workers, the need for education and skills. With technological change shifting labor demand, we see low skills, weak mobility within farm workers. So we need skills that are aligned with a changing value chain. But then also consideration being made for worker protection and rights. So climate-driven farm closures, which could increase displacement and eviction risks. And then most importantly, economic diversification. Because ALMPs alone are not going to absorb any sort of job losses within these farm-dependent towns. So ALMPs very much become an important part of economic diversification becomes an important part of ALMPs for ALMPs to be successful. So some key considerations within this context is that ALMPs, or in the context of farm workers, we see that skills and livelihood development will be important for supporting farm workers to adapt to climate change. We do see some elements, especially at the provincial level. However, largely, a lot of these programs are not inherently developed to improve farm worker livelihoods. And existing research continues to suggest that limited attention is being paid to systemic upskilling of farm workers and that agricultural stakeholders have yet to be adequately transformed to meet the developmental needs of farm workers. And most importantly, ALMPs within this context cannot succeed in the absence of genuine economic opportunities. Historically, ALMPs were developed during post-war Europe, during periods of strong economic growth and rising labor demand, where the primary function was essentially to facilitate worker transition into new jobs rather than creating employment directly. So in this context, we see, in this context of South Africa's low or exceptionally low employment levels, economic diversification becomes a precondition. So further consideration needs to be made for redeployment, perhaps. Could this be viable in certain cases, especially in the horticultural sector, where climate change may worsen the quality of fruit or export quality of fruit, and perhaps expanding processing activities within agriculture-dependent towns for juices, dried fruit, etc. But then also consideration needs to then be made for migration. So how do we ensure that when farm workers lose their jobs or when they move, where can they go? Where are better economic opportunities? And are they fit for those economic opportunities? So that said, LMPs need to be more adaptable in responding to local context. So the central challenge here is consideration between creating this balance between training first or working first approaches. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. I think, yeah, that gives us some really useful insights into some quite complex difficulties that farm workers are going to be facing, and a lot of unknowns around climate change. But the importance of having, as Neva has also emphasized, having that package of response measures that will really make an impact. We now turn to our next speaker, Kate Rivet-Carnac, who is an independent consultant and expert in the tourism sector. Good morning, Kate. Thank you for joining us. Kate is going to be presenting her paper on ecotourism attraction, climate vulnerability, is also has a series of papers that are available on the website that look at employment vulnerability and sector job resilience in the tourism sector. Kate, I'm looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Saul. Can everyone see this okay?
Yeah, we can hear you and we can see the
Brilliant.
presentation.
Okay, so as Saul said, just to relate what I'm presenting today to what Neva presented, there is already an economic vulnerability assessment and sector jobs resilience plan on the website for TIPS, looks at tourism. Because of the findings there, in that ecotourism attractions are important draw cards for tourists, we decided to have a deeper look at that particular element. So it's a bit different from what Michael did in terms of methodology, but very interesting and I think important, and refers to some of the points Neva was making about the need for institutional capacity, but I'll come to that. So tourism, why do we think about tourism? Why are we even considering it? It's a very important source of employment in our country. It has a broad geographic distributional impact as well. So we know it's particularly important in areas that are well known for their natural attractions. And we've seen climate events already impact in these areas and around the country. For example, the Kruger floods in January, the estimated costs to infrastructure alone were about 500 million. And then Stats SA has done some research into biodiversity-based tourism, which is a subset of tourism. They have a satellite account, I think, that they produced for this or something approximating that. And they showed that in 2019, biodiversity-based tourism contributed 28 billion to GDP and supported over 91,000 jobs. So it gives you a sense of why it's so important. So I was interested in exploring the climate threats to the top ecotourism attractions in the country, again, understanding their role in drawing in tourists, which then creates the local economic development effect, if you like. But not so much only the threats, because there's lots of science on that, even though there are areas where we need to enhance that. But in particular, how is that impacting on trends in adaptive capacity? So in other words, how are the institutions that are managing these ecotourism sites responding, and what can we find, particularly in terms of technical or technological, institutional and financial resources? So I first of all looked at ecotourism attraction site selection, and I used visitor statistics from South African tourism, chose to include natural World Heritage sites, and also included one site per province, just to make sure we were considering sites across the country. I reviewed documents, and I also undertook some interviews with key informants. So the top ecotourism attraction sites that I landed on were 13. In the middle column where it says ownership management, you can see that Sand Parks is the steward for many of them, but we also have municipalities, the coastal management teams in Cape Town and eThekwini, the private landowners in the case of the Cape Winelands, although there I interviewed SA Wine, which is one of the industry mandated agencies. And provincial protected areas included Pilanesberg, and then I also included Isimangaliso and Ukuhlamba Drakensberg, which are both World Heritage sites. but they also have a relationship with Esenver located in wildlife. So in terms of the document review, which was sort of a general consideration of tourism and adaptation literature, there is the point made, and I've already made it, that we need to build adaptive capacity for resilience in the face of these climate shocks and slower climate changes too. This is very much reinforced by the Africa chapter of the IPCC's Assessment Report 6, which talks about the work that needs to be done. And it's pointed out that adaptation on the continent is fragmented, small scale and uneven, and that furthermore, some of the possible responses aren't feasible because of technological, institutional, and financial barriers that they face. In our own country's second NDC, which was submitted last year, the call is also made in this regard for significantly scaled up international finance and non-financial support for national adaptation strategies, but also for sectoral ones and sub-national planning. And so this really underscores the point that we need to think about these institutional, technological, and financial capabilities. Interestingly, there are actually some pieces of policy and planning that's been undertaken nationally in South Africa on tourism and climate change. There were 4 that I identified. The last one, climate change, was part of a broader tourism environmental implementation plan. They all talk about the need for improved communication and coordination amongst stakeholders, as well as other sort of key elements relating to their particular focus. It's worth noting in the recent white paper of 2024 and in the current strategic plan of the department, as well as last year's G20 ministerial announcements, the focus is very much on resilience planning for disasters. And that, I think, comes from our recognition that tourism's already been affected by climate disasters like the drought in Cape Town and the floods in Durban, and of course, recently Kruger. There is significant academic work in the space in South Africa with more than 39 studies. But what is interesting is that tourism industry players, and by that I mean the private sector, don't have a clear position. So they acknowledge, and they acknowledge at an individual operator level, that there are risks, and they're either very worried or somewhat worried, but there isn't an industry response. As I mentioned, I undertook interviews with managers and specialists at the top ecotourism attraction, and on the left you can see the institutions I interviewed. I see SA Wine isn't there, it should be there. Oh, it is there, it's Cape Wineland. So SA Wine was the actual institution. And within Isimangaliso's case, I didn't actually interview anyone, but I was provided with some of their latest research. And as I introduced at the beginning of my presentation, I was really interested in exploring, yes, the risks, but really the responses and how this relates to challenges and opportunities. So I don't have much time. There is a paper. I hope you'll read it if you're interested. I found it fascinating, this research. But at a sort of high level, it's the beaches that are the least at risk for now. So there are climate impacts on coastlines, but they're not yet as severe, nor do they result in loss of visitation like we're seeing in protected areas. And one of the positive findings was that of the institutions I interviewed, the City of Cape Town's coastal management team has significantly invested in their capacities and institutional knowledge, as well as valuation techniques. If we look at sort of terrestrial protected areas, the national and provincial areas and parks and protected areas are already experiencing severe climate impacts, and I've made this point already, but they're also often fundamentally challenged with just general site maintenance and upkeep and sometimes basic governance, and I'll talk about this more. So they're already in a difficult situation, and if you like, climate change impacts are compounding that. The Cape Winelands was an interesting example to include as distinct from the rest because it comprises hundreds of individual farms, and what is a challenge there is that many of the farmers aren't making sufficient profits to reinvest or adopt new technologies. So this is actually, if you like, a finding not just for tourism, but for agriculture too. So, you know, and what happens is if these farms are subject to, say, for example, a wildfire, and this has been the case, of course, in some instances, it takes a generation to recover. So that is a particular challenge there. But interestingly, and encouragingly, there already are a number of research assessment tools and applications that exist. So in other words, in terms of the technological adaptation, in theory, we do have some of the answers about what we could do. So the gap is really on implementation. But just some examples, SA Wine has TerraClim, which is looks at different kinds of better cultivars. They also have pre-breeding genetic programs with other countries and university partnerships. Sandparks has a climate vulnerability assessment methodology. It's actually been rolled out across the continent now. They have their own pilots, and they're doing in-depth assessments as they update the management plans. Provincial protected areas do know the techniques, some of which are low-tech, but they struggle to consistently implement them, and that's things like the right kind of road maintenance. Isimangaliso, because it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has recently conducted a climate vulnerability index. So they also understand the risks, they understand some of the technological responses, and they have some ecosystem adaptation partnerships with NGOs, for example. And similarly, for the beaches, there are already soft and hard infrastructure responses been put in place. There's a prioritization approach that's taken by the metros in responding to where they focus their resources, their asset valuation techniques, and modeling and engineering skills that are being invested in. But the real issue is the financial precarity for the most part of these institutions, and it's particularly the case for provincial protected areas. And a number of these institutions have seen a declining budget in real terms in terms of the fiscal transfers. They're also hit by a national decline in expanded public works partnerships funding. And often these programs are rolled out either in sandparks or provincial parks. One of the provinces I spoke to is moving away from private premiums. It's just unaffordable to them. So they're looking at self-insurance, but that means that there's an insurance gap. So there's a certain inevitable reliance on disaster declarations by government, which then means that funds at a provincial level can be reallocated, but this is certainly not a sustainable approach. So while Sandparks relies heavily on tourism income, it's around 70% of their income. This is good, I suppose, in terms of their reliance on the fiscus, but it means that when key parks like Kruger or Table Mountain are hit by either a climate event or another event, there's a serious impact for the whole parks network. And then Cape Winelands, as I mentioned, only around 20% of farms are profitable. So it's very challenging for forward planning and investments. And eThekwini Coastal Management is coping at the moment, but they also noted some budget constraints. So financial precarity is in general a real challenge. And part of the reason, and part of the impact of this is that management effectiveness can be impaired. There was an important study in 2023 on provincial protected areas institutions that looked at their management effectiveness. And there was a broad finding that these provincial protected areas, so this would be provincial parks typically, or conservation areas, are often challenged with general site upkeep and skills and governance. And there's a quote there just around the challenges linked to staff, infrastructure equipment, maintenance, and procurement. And if you look at the annual reports published for example, Northwest Parks and Tourism Board, which manages Pilanesberg, it was noted, certainly in 2024, that there was no board, and that it acknowledged in this report that there wasn't adequate maintenance. Isimangaliso Wetland Park met all its KPIs in 2024-25, but if we look at the climate vulnerability index that was undertaken, they note there that there's low to moderate effectiveness of capacity. And as I mentioned, though, on the positive side, the City of Cape Town has managed to invest increasingly over the last 10 or more years in building its capacity, and eThekwini is currently investing in new coastal modeling skills and technical partnerships. I'm not talking about it much today, but I think it's really important to understand the context of many of these protected areas. And here I'm talking about parks and conservation areas. And they have a variety of adjacent landowners and communities that affect impact their operations and are critical for their operations. And as you can well imagine, there are differing socioeconomic vulnerabilities as well as often a strong reliance on the ecotourism attractions. But we have to recognize there's a context of historic forced removals often in these protected areas, and historically a kind of fortress conservation that didn't include local people. We've seen a reversal from that in many ways, and sand parks and provinces now often have co-management agreements, but these are often very poor areas, particularly when you're talking about more rural spaces. There are not a lot of economic opportunities. So there are a range of pressures that are created, but also opportunities and the necessity for partnerships. And this then brings me to my last slide. So very interestingly, across the institutions I spoke to, they're all already building really creative partnerships. And this is necessary for flexibility and resilience. And understanding the constrained finances and management effectiveness I spoke about, they have to work through partnerships. And this is the main adaptive management strategy. So one example is the extensive NGO and volunteer cohorts that sand parks in the provinces rely on. So the honorary rangers got mentioned a number of times. And these days, they're often undertaking day-to-day maintenance as well as, if you like, more strategic projects. But there's a potential for further strategic partnerships. The tourism industry has not got as involved in climate change as it has in other critical areas. So we know that the tourism industry has been involved in things like rhino poaching, in addressing safety and security risks to tourists around Southern Kruger. So we have successful models for sort of local area specific issue partnerships with the tourism industry. And I think that's an example of a model that could be rolled out for climate change. Not necessarily at a national level, maybe with national level support, but it would have to be devolved to the specific ecotourism sites. And then in terms of investing in nature-based solutions, this is very, very important. It would be part of the core mandates of protected areas management institutions. And it would have been historically significantly increased with expanded public works programs. And this would be things like removing alien vegetations and those sort of things. And there is an opportunity now to look for other sources of funding and partnerships for nature-based solutions. So while expanding while growing the expanded public works program as a government program may not be something that happens in the near-term future, sort of variations on that could be possible, working with private sector or not-for-profit groups or community groups. And the Drakensberg's a particularly important example. The Kuchlamba Drakensberg World Heritage Sites, critical, one could argue, not primarily for tourism, but really for its role as a strategic water source area. And we know water is a cross-cutting challenge in our country. And if one could remove the vegetation that's encroaching there, you release water, you improve biodiversity, you reduce fire risk, and increase tourism attractiveness. So it's a really, I think, profound example of win-win-win projects. But all of this and the other findings in the Sector Jobs Resilience Plan, which are sort of at a national level, really need far better collaboration, coordination, and communication. So I'll leave it there, and I would like to urge you to read the paper if you're interested in more information. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. I think the presentation for me highlights just the importance of these ecotourism sites, not only for the income for the parks, but also the surrounding tourism that takes place alongside these natural attractions, and the risks to the livelihoods of multiple businesses and economic activities are then compromised. And I think the research really does take us forward in thinking through some of the challenges, particularly around budgets, but also the huge opportunities that emerge. Thank you. We're now going to move to our next presentation, and that's from Akona, who's going to be talking to weather and climate prediction effectiveness, implications for resilience, information sharing, sectoral adaptation, and livelihoods in South Africa. Akona is an economist at TIPS. Over to you, Akona. Thank you.
Thank you, Saul. Good morning, everyone. Can you see my slides?
We can see your slides and we can hear you clearly. Thanks.
Right. As introduced by Saul, I'll be presenting on evaluating the effectiveness of weather forecasting services in South Africa. This is a deep dive that speaks to mostly tourism and agriculture. So the research, so I'll be presenting, I'll first start out by examining climate change trends and historical extreme weather patterns in South Africa. And then I'll move on to evaluating the forecast accuracy, infrastructure reliability, how weather forecasts are communicated, and the forecast to action gap. Then I'll look at the weather prediction models or the weather prediction system or ecosystem in South Africa and evaluate that for forecast accuracy. Then I'll look at analyzing sectoral and socioeconomic vulnerabilities of the extreme weather events. And then I will look at system level and institutional constraints and propose some improvements for strengthening South Africa's prediction ecosystem. So when we look at South Africa's risk profile, so in 2024, as reported by the Climate Action Carbon Tracker, South Africa exceeded the critical 1.5 degrees Celsius global temperature threshold above pre-industrial levels. The period between 2011 to 2025 saw 51% of all extreme events recorded since 2000. The impacts are regionally uneven. If you look at the figure on the right, firstly, before I speak to the figure, it is important to note that the data that I used for the analysis in the study is from the emergency disaster database, which applies a certain criteria for the kind of weather events that it records. So it might not capture all of the extreme events or all of the affected. It is used as an instructive or as a database that is able to show you the pattern, right? So if you look at the graph of the figure on the right, you can see that the regions are unevenly affected. If you look at the coastal provinces like Eastern Cape, KZN, and Western Cape, they carry a disproportionate share of the high extreme events. If you look at the heat maps, and then KZN and Eastern Cape are mostly hit by tropical systems like your storms and your floods, while Western Cape faces variable rainfall, droughts, and wildfires. If you look at your inland provinces like in Northern Cape, Northwest, you see that they face extreme heat, drought, and wildfire risk. And then when you look at the figure, you can see that the key trend is that droughts affect the highest of the population, while floods account for most fatalities and financial damage. This raises a question which centers the rest of the presentation of whether forecasting systems delivering sufficiently localized and reliable information will risk the highest, and to the issuing of forecasts initiate decision making in a way that is able to protect livelihoods and mitigate losses. So also, again, if you look at the figure on the right, this is according to districts now. So the impact of the extreme events are now, the heat map shows according to districts, because the emergency database does not show according to localities, which would have a more nuanced granularity of seeing the losses in a more nuanced way, right? So when we look at the historical events that have affected South Africa, we see that the 2015 to 2018 drought led to more than 16 billion agricultural losses, and for more than 40,000 agricultural jobs were lost. If we look at the 2017 Knysna wildfires, you can see that there was more than 303 billion in damages, and it led to widespread evacuations, right? And if you look at the 2022 KwaZulu-Natal floods, we see that over 450 people were affected. 450 people died, and it led to more than 17 billion infrastructure damage. Recently, the Eastern Cape floods led to 90 deaths and 1,000 displaced. So in many cases, you can see that forecasts were issued, but losses remained devastating, right? So the losses that we can see as shown by the instructive cases of these extreme weather events is that there is a systemic and institutional failures that you cannot only attribute to how severe climate has become over the years. So now we move on to why forecasting effectiveness is important, right? So as I've mentioned before, between 2000 and 2005, South Africa recorded more than 100 weather-related disasters. This is according to the emergency database that I have said before that it was the basis of the analysis for this study. And we see that more than 31 million people have been affected, with economic damages exceeding 180 billion. And it is important to note that climate-related shocks, as mentioned by my colleagues, affect employment. Through job losses, they reduce working days because in some cases, there's road closures, and then they disrupt production cycles and they lead to business closures, right? They lead to business closures. And then this leads me to make a statement that says that forecast accuracy alone is not sufficient if warnings do not reach users or fail to trigger action. In that, the forecasts that are issued by the South African Weather Services must be able to initiate decision making or be able to tell people what decision they need to make to protect themselves against a potential loss, right? And then I make also another statement that says that the forecast system or the forecast ecosystem should not prioritize scientific accuracy over protecting livelihoods and reducing socio-economic costs, right? So when I looked at the South African Weather Services annual reports, these are some of the system constraints that they said that they are facing. For instance, they make a mention of aging infrastructure and updated radars, which fit into their observation framework. And then they talk about fragmented institutional constraints that lead to them not meeting some of the performance targets that they've set out for themselves. I highlight this because it will make sense as to why I'm highlighting it, and it's something that has been reportedly been presented, or that has been reportedly said by the South African Weather Services as the national agency for reporting weather in South Africa, and it will make sense in the slides to come. So I reached out to the South African Weather Services, right, for data which they could not give me due to commercialization reasons, but they did give me something that is called a KMZ file, which shows me which, when you overlay that over Google Maps, it will show you an overlay of the weather stations that the South African Weather Services has. And the South African Weather Services has 246 automatic weather stations, 24 weather offices, and when it comes to rainfall monitoring, they have more than 1,000 manual rainfall stations, but importantly, and it will make sense why I say it's important, they have 141 automatic rainfall stations, right? So when I looked at the metrics of performance that they have according to their annual reports, they report that they have forecast accuracy of more than 97% in recent years. So if you look at 2018, 2019, 2020 to 2024, 2025, the average of that is 97%, right? However, you remember I said they say that the map overlay shows that they have 141 automatic rainfall stations, right? Which the metric they use for that is the radar availability. So if you look at the radar availability, you can see that in 2022, 2023, and 2023, 2024, they have reported 52%, and then 44%, right? Now, radars are essential to real-time monitoring of storm detection that are fast occurring and nowcasting, which is 0 to 6 hours, and the calibration of the models that they use, like your numerical weather prediction model. And they have 141 automatic rainfall stations. So looking at their forecast accuracy, which is above 97%, and you look at what fits the models that they then use, which is your radar availability, The question that I now have in my stance as an economist is, how is the high forecast accuracy sustained when the observation system, which is feeding the models, is intermittently unavailable, as shown by their radar availability and according to their metric that they have, which is their performance targets. Then when we look at sectoral impacts for agriculture, climate information is a productive asset. It tells farmers when to plant, and the decisions when the farmers have already planted are irreversible. If you look at the economic impact, you see that agriculture contracted by 16% during the 2015 to 2018 drought. Food prices rose to approximately 20%. There was accelerated job losses, right? And then if you look at the recent Eastern Cape floods, they killed more than 1,000 livestock, right? But importantly, what I also faced when I was doing the research is the access to information. So there is now a structural divide in terms of access to climate information, right? Because commercial farmers have the financial resources to have a specialized and high resolution services from the Agricultural Research Council and the South African Weather Services, they are at a better advantage than smallholder farmers, which is a problem because if you look at the graph on the right, you can see that the concentration of smallholder farmers is in Eastern Cape, KZN, and Limpopo. And if you look at the overlay of the map on Google Maps, you can see that these are the regions that have the most minimal weather stations, right? So I then conclude to say that unequal access to climate information reinforces the structural constraints that exist of inequality that exists within agriculture. When I look into tourism, right, tourism is also, as mentioned by Kate, is also highly affected by the climate variability, right? So extreme events reduce destination attractiveness. They disrupt transport systems because extreme events like floods lead to road closures. They also lead to seasonal job losses, right? And then tourism depends on high confidence forecast to manage safety. Tourism operators need certain kind of information to plan itineraries and to plan the attractions that they are going to show to tourists. And then when we look at the socio-economic impact, I don't have much time to explain what is happening on the figure on the right, but importantly, but I can do that during the question and answer session. But when you look at the socio-economic impacts, as I have already mentioned, extreme event causes uneven socio-economic losses with GDP, jobs, and food security and livelihoods hit the hardest hit in high-risk regions. And poor households are the most affected due to limited insurance and savings, making weather shocks long lasting. And then the high risk regions should be prioritized for investment in forecasting infrastructure, localized warnings, and last mile communication. So the last part of the presentation looks at the constraints that have been mentioned by South African Weather Services in the annual reports, and then I make recommendations. So one of the recommendations that I make is that the South African Weather Services should stabilize and prioritize radar availability. They should strengthen regional observation density. They should also integrate data sets across institutions like the Agricultural Research Council, CSIR, to ensure data interoperability. And then one of the final conclusions that I want to make is that South Africa does not have a failure of a forecasting science, but it has a failure of how the forecasts are communicated, how localized they are, the regional coverage, and institutional coordination. And with that, I would like to thank you, and I'm looking forward to engage in the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Akona. Your presentation, I think, raises some of the complexity and importance of the climate prediction, but also the capabilities that we have as a country. What also comes through very strongly, I think, is the economic impacts of all of this, and your recommendations, the need to invest in these areas, because if we don't, we risk falling behind and falling victim to events that we could have had some mitigation responses to. I don't think we're going to be able to stop some of these events, but at least we would have better warning and avoid possibly some of the negative outcomes. So thank you very much for your input. We now move to our last presentation before we will then go to our discussant. So our last presentation is by Gillian Chigumero, who's an economist at TIPS, and she's going to be presenting on diffusion of climate change technology, innovation and practices for small-scale farmers. Over to you, Gillian. Thank you.
Thank you, Saul. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
We can do both. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll be presenting on one of the deep dives to the SJRP agricultural value chain, and it's on diffusion of climate change, technology, innovation, and practices for small-scale farmers. So I'll just go through the problem statement, some of the tech and innovation available, some of the initiatives by public and private sector, and then some of the challenges and constraints being faced. And I think as my colleagues have noted that climate change has really intensified vulnerabilities across tourism and agriculture. And what we've seen in several studies is that there are a range of climate change technology mitigation and innovation available in South Africa. Just for example, one of them was by the World Bank and CARDESA, and that looked at some agri-tech firms operating in smart farming in South Africa. But what is important to note that is diffusion and uptake do remain uneven. It is mainly skewed towards large-scale farmers who rapidly are able to adopt. And this is also because of their access to industry networks, some government programs and finance. But we also see a disproportionate burdens on small-scale farmers who do still face barriers because of fewer assets and limited access to formal credit and the system environment they're operating in. I think it's important for us to just understand what's happening with small-scale farmers in South Africa. I won't go into the definition and number. It is a little bit unclear and not straightforward, but so it is about plus or minus 200,000. But we do want to use the national statistics we do have. So if we look at the census of agricultural households, there are about 2.4 million practicing agriculture. 80% mainly produce for their own consumption or subsistence farmers, 7.2% for sale and their own consumption, 7% for kind of come from. And so if we're looking at graph 1 to our left there, just as an aggregate for all provinces, the vulnerabilities are also going to differ. So those who mainly produce for consumption or subsistence will definitely face issues of food insecurity in relation to climate change. And those who produce mainly for sale would also face issues of loss of income and the inability to reinvest. And if we look at our growth by stock and poultry, and again, if we're looking at vulnerability, they're also going to face issues of diseases, mortality, and also declining grazing lands. And then also next is the production of grains and fruit, and also drought would have a big impact, loss of production as well to that. Now, we just want to look at some of the climate change mitigating technology and innovation and practices. And so if we look at the level of ranges, this could be from low to high to medium to advanced. And I'll just speak to about 4 of them. So for example, you do have innovation and tech innovation if we're thinking of mitigating against, for example, floods. And this is low tech size fences or cover crops, or for example, just putting nets against weather risks such as hail and windstorms. And also, if we're just also looking at medium to advanced to high tech, we're also looking at biotechnology and gene editing, referring back that most small farmers and households do rear livestock. And so we're looking at the use of drought-tolerant crops, resistant live crop breeds, and also recently some DNA testing to improve some cattle breeds. And I think a big one also with declining grazing lands due to also droughts, alternative feeds, as well as pests and vaccines. If we also look at water management as well, just some medium to advanced tech can be smart irrigation, or for example, advanced tech such as soil moisture enhancer product such as hydrogel polymers. And then lastly, for example, weather initiatives such as, I think Akon has spoken to this, your agrometeorology apps, which do kind of help to better focus and predict and prepare better and sometimes be able to adapt. Now, what was quite important for this research was just to also check access and adoption for small-scale farmers. Again, unfortunately, the number is not so straightforward. But what I do want to say is there are a lot of studies, research that has been done by the public and private, and there's a fragmented studies. So the complexity is some may focus on crops, some may focus on the type of technology. And remember, there's spillovers into communities. So there can be double counting, or this number could be a little bit overstated. And so this also, there is a difficulty in having a cumulative impact as a nation on what's happening there. But again, we want to draw from public data. So CST, DSA, and HSRC do produce the survey for large business involved in using innovation. And if we look at the graph there, we can see some of the innovation that they have access and have adopted helps with climate change mitigation. For example, your precision agriculture, their soil sensors, or use, as I've said, of smart animal breeding. And then if we also look at the map below, which also helps us to infer what is happening, we can see there's high adoption, for example, in the Northern Cape and Western Cape and Gauteng province, compared to lesser adoption in KZN, Mpumalanga, and the Eastern Cape. And these are actually areas where we also have a lot of small-scale farmers and households. But what I do want to reiterate is that quite a number of studies that have looked into access into tech for climate change, the conclusion still amounts that there are disparities in access and uptake, and most of it is to large-scale farmers. And so just looking into some of the findings, it was what are initiatives being done by the public and private sector. So in the middle there, we call them our change agents. And these are just some of the organizations I managed to speak to. I had public profiles in the report. And so if we look at the technology and innovation that's being supported, ranging from low, medium, high tech, we can also see across government and public sector, low tech such as encouraging mulching, shaded nets, smart tunnels. If we look at the high tech, again, go back to issues of livestock and poultry. And so there's also been support for the provision of drought and resistant disease cutting, especially for in the sugar industry. And also because I've already spoken about declining grazing lands and just the innovation in alternative feeds, for example, your black fly protein feed. And also quite interesting, is support in biosecurity apps where people are able to visualize diseases. If you think about it, as grazing lands decline, cattle move, and so foot and mouth also spreads. And also even, for example, in Mpumalanga, in small-scale growers for timber, just DNA fingerprinting and trying to figure out the best breeds. And what more is important also to our right is the methods are to promote diffusion and adaptation. A big one is the practical training. A lot of research has shown the success, especially in technical demonstrations. And this also hedges on our extension services. So besides practical training, there's also a lot of theory-based training. We've also seen knowledge transfer between the private and public sector. For example, the Citrus Academy training public extension officers. We do also have centers supporting innovation. We call them farmer support centers. Some of them are nascent. One includes, for example, FarmRoo in Limpopo supporting sustainable farming, and academia also comes in, for example, using test beds, using small-scale farmers for some trials and experimental plots, and just involving them to participate and kind of see the differences, and also in different digital and media, print media, for example, e-extension offices. Now, the major findings and challenges that we did see is institutional constraints. We have had a decline in the number of extension officers, and as I said, they are quite important as farmers are able post and prior, just having access to extension officers is largely declined. Currently, the latest statistics in 2024-2025 was about 1:1,400, but the recommended ratio that the government would like to reach is 1:250 farmers. Also, the lack of infrastructure constraints, just basic farm equipment to practice tech. If it's rainwater harvesting, people might not have access to some of the tanks they need. And just aging water infrastructure, it's difficult also to demonstrate smart irrigation if people don't have access to water. And I think a big one is also financial and affordability. If we just think of the high cost of drones and also for DNA testing, and also memberships to associations where they do have access to some of this tech or at least knowledge about it. And we mustn't forget the issue of profitability, which also against immediate livelihood pressures. And also I think that was some of the knowledge and skills that it can be difficult interpreting some predictive model outputs for farmers. And one issue that everyone I think is grappling with is climate change. I remember, I think the University of Pretoria noted it's just difficult to keep up with vaccination scheduling, and the example was used with avian flu and migratory birds just changing route all the time. But again, back to national statistics as well, the big survey, the SESTI survey, also notes just there's a lack of awareness to the use of facilities for innovation and also awareness of government support for innovation. And as I conclude, again, the key takeaways, I think we have seen definitely the impact of climate change. We do have a number of technology to help mitigate risk and be resilient technologies. But the diffusion, as I said, is very skewed to large-scale farmers. We still face persistent challenges. And again, as I said, there are several studies, research being done, so it is still fragmented to get that nice cumulative impact. And so in concluding, if we just look at some of the pathways to foster diffusion, access, and adoption, I think for me, it's also important to bridge the data on smallholders. So I think it's important if we leverage with what we already have, for example, the DSI survey, to extend it to include small-scale farmers, and this could be rolled out provincially to kind of see, do they have access, the adoption levels, and also just a feedback loop of some of the private initiative, and so that it can be integrated into national statistics. And some of the methods of diffusion, I think one article was noting, who do farmers interact with on a more daily basis? And also just making sure your agro dealers, service providers, input providers, and financiers are also brought in the loop, help some of this information. And as I said, a positive one was just scaling up demonstration plots. And in terms of skills and personnel, I think it's important to expand some of the programs happening. I've already noted private and public sector working together and training public officials on climate smart practices, and also just expanding digital extinction services. And also, again, finance was an issue. So I do think promoting some cooperative hub purchasing models for this technology, or them also having access to association memberships, and also just drawing from the available agriculture funds to support some of this access to technologies, and just increasing awareness of the current facilities available, as well as just also investing. I think this is for the whole of South Africa, infrastructure, as we move in an era of connectivity and some decentralized solutions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gillian. Yeah, thank you. I think that presentation gives us some very useful and practical steps that can be taken, but also highlights that there are some very simple solutions. There's expensive solutions, but there's also some simple ones that can really contribute to resilience, and also using some of the latest technologies that are available can take us forward in trying to solve some of the challenges that are going to be faced by small-scale farmers. So thank you very much. I'm now going to move over to our discussant, and that's Dr. Ariel Prinsloo, who's from the School of Geography, Archaeology and Environmental Studies. And she's going to give us some of her insights on the papers. You don't have to cover everything, but where you see is important. And thanks very much for joining us and participating in the seminar. Over to you, Ariel.
Thank you, and thank you for all the presenters. This work is fabulous and also quite telling. It's very, very big, complex problems, and I can appreciate that within each of these spaces of work, it's about sort of unpacking these problems and really also focusing on a problem, because as we know, problems breed problems. It's helpful to use a particular lens. So yes, I will try to I'll try to synthesize as best as I can, but also a disclaimer coming from my background. I'm predominantly a biometeorologist, so really looking at the connection between climate and humans in particular, and the particular space I'm in now is tourism. So the agricultural aspect might not be fully covered. But what I can say is that it's very telling from all these particular inputs that collaboration at different levels is really key, I think, but also questioning what that collaboration looks like and bringing in, or really a question, and this will be a question to, I guess, the rest of the panel, of what particular monitoring and evaluation processes are in place to track how these collaborations are working out. From different levels, from, for example, sort of the ecotourism space, right? We know that we're looking at this gigantic tourism industry and what that means for specific organizations like sandparks and stuff, but also looking at who is having these conversations. If you're looking at sandparks and, for example, working with spaces like the Weather Service, or let's say, for example, another NGO, WWF, right? You're looking at how these particular institutions are getting their funding and what international funding commitments have been made, right? And what are these bottom lines that these particular stakeholders are aiming for? But to go back to Dr. Hector's first presentation, these particular policies, I'm not really, I guess, I've learned about it today, let's say it that way. But just looking at this aspect of transition, I find it really interesting that in the space of, we're looking at the short-term, the whole things of, let me just rephrase myself in my notes. These LMMPs, right, to mitigate these short-term job losses and to prevent these long-term unemployment happenings. I'm finding it very curious why, and this goes back to Neva's point in the very beginning, why not plan for these worst case scenarios? And the worst case scenarios are that these jobs won't even be available because agriculture will be dead. But in the steps towards that, what would these LMMPs PS is how would they consider that worst case scenario steps? In terms of even relocating, your worst case scenario is that you relocate to nothing. So what would those relocation aspects be? Yeah, and Dr. Hector, maybe you could come in towards the end. I don't want to overwhelm with information, but what would those specific aspects be? But also within that, and this kind of leads to the other aspects on diffusion technologies, and even within the forecasting issues of using these smaller components, right? I'm thinking of like this bigger web that sort of leaches down into these small groups, but these small groups seem pretty isolated in how are they talking to each other and what processes could be involved to help employment diversification within those underskilled vulnerable groups, because those are the biggest, I guess, problem areas, or what sort of sources would help between those community, like those, what connections would be needed to help those come together. And this relates to even forecasting what would be the processes of getting local weather stations to those local people to then feed up to these bigger institutional aspects that we, as you've stated, Akona, that they're struggling. And we know that access to data is not just a South Africa issue, it's a global South issue. Really, these gaps in data that they are feeding them, there's only so much proxy data you could use, that what would be the instances of using these very small groups of people to help monitor that. And along with that, as we've mentioned, and Dr. Hector even mentioned, in terms of training, how can we train individuals? What are the CETA's involvement, and how, I mean, let's just call it what it is. What capacity can they offer, and why is their capacity limited in offering training? And even linking to what you said of work first or train first, why not both? Is my question to that. And yeah, in looking at these, I am very conscious of time, so I could be missing out on things. Apologies for that. And I'm also leading this to you. There's a majority economists in this particular panel of what are the economic models here around the bottom line equating to this building of resilience. Is it even something that these economic models are sort of understanding that, is it framed in sort of like a capitalist sense of like one needs to have sort of large, vast amount of profits, or those can be reduced to in building resilience? So I'm curious about those there. And then, yeah, just in general, it's I guess this sort of web of knowledge that I'm curious about your thoughts of how you get smaller, vulnerable populations not to fix themselves. That's not the problem. One needs to help and address these problems very cautiously, can I say. But what tools are available for those vulnerable, less skilled individuals to build within themselves to help build into bigger sort of structures, so that they don't get lost in these bigger industries, bigger commercial farms, etc. That was very long-winded. I'm happy to clarify where needed, but yes, it's 12:30, so I'll pass it over to you, Saul, to then moderate. Thank you.
Thanks. You're welcome to have 2 or 3 minutes more. Are you fine?
I would rather, like, I've posed a lot of questions. I think at this particular time, maybe the panel can open up on their particular thoughts. I'm happy to recap, but yeah, I'm happy to maybe start those so that they have more chance to answer their considerations of that. Yes.
Right. Okay, thank you very much for your insights. I'm now going to, before we get to the panel responding to those questions posed by Ariel, I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. There are some in the chat, and you can raise your hand as well and give your input or question. And then also, if you want to, you can also pose your questions into the group chat. It doesn't have to be delivered in person. Let me invite then Elise to ask her question. Elise, if you want to unmute.
Thank you, Saul. Yeah, I think my question would be maybe for Michael and also Gillian, just regarding the level of debts that your studies covered on financial constraints. I think this came out in a number of the presentations. There was a facility of 50 million euros at the Land Bank sitting for 12 years from 2018, and they couldn't deploy the funds. So I interviewed Nauru about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago when we looked at access to inclusive finance for small-scale farmers. And what they were saying is the uptake was there, so there was sufficient demand for financial products, but the financiers didn't understand how to finance and assess the risks of the farmers. So it was very interesting because they lost that fund. It was really specifically aimed at mitigation and adaptation, a brilliant fund. And so there's also, in terms of the financial sector, I think a little bit of a capacity need on understanding what the new kind of climate finance would require for climate smart technologies. There's been a few other innovations, I think, in terms of the energy. There's a couple of interesting new funds, but I wonder if your studies could maybe just cover a little bit more on the financial mechanisms, because the policy brief would be helpful to also advise how you can look at that gap so that the money can actually land to where the need is. So that's just one of my recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Elise. I'm seeing in the chat there was a question earlier from Maria to Kate about the consequences of increasing costs for the consumer in accessing national parks, and if there's a risk that would make that those spaces exclusive. And then there's a comment from Sean around the challenges of water stewardship affecting some of the regional tourism activities. And then just the question from Alex, I'm not sure who would best, but whether we've looked at the network for greening the finance system, and if that's been looked at, or we would look at going forward. And then I see the question from Mokhadi has been answered already in the text by Michael. Okay, let me ask each of our panelists to respond to the issues that have been put in the chat, the questions, and also from the discussant, and then we can open up for a second round of questions or comments. Thank you. Should we go in order of presentation? So starting from Michael and then ending with Gillian. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you, Saul. I'm going to start with Elise and then work my way back. So in terms of the financial constraints, when I was speaking to stakeholders and within the value chain, and there's no other way to put this, when it comes to farm workers' livelihoods and protection and anything related to them, it becomes the room kind of goes mute. It's a very touchy subject, and it's because of our history and because of how the work issues related to rights and access to development and skills, etc. So from what I've seen, and the study didn't really go into depth into these financial mechanisms, but from what I've seen, a lot of these mechanisms are not directed at farm workers specifically, and perhaps Joel can answer the rest of the question. But in terms from the deep dive on the farm workers, not much that I could find was directed at farm workers. Other than that, that's already being done by very specific NGOs that are targeted at supporting livelihoods and providing funding during job losses, etc. But those are obviously non-governmental and private. But in terms of and back to the question of how would these specific aspects look like, and the question around work first or train first. And essentially, it can be both, but it will depend on the type of workers that we're dealing with. For example, with farm workers, because the education levels are so low, we will have to start at train first. We need to develop skills. And in terms of sort of, I think it was more of a long-term question. And this is why I highlighted economic diversification and skills development. And this is specifically to farm workers, is because the skills development, we need that to help farmers to either adapt, to either match the skills of farms adopting climate technologies, adopting climate smart technologies, but then also to provide them with skills so that they can be either redeployed or transition to other forms of work. But once again, economic diversification becomes the main thing, not only within these farm towns, but also broad at a provincial level as well. I'm hoping that answers Ariel's question and Elise's question. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Michael. Kate?
Thanks for the comments in the chat, and also Ariel for your questions, which I think tried to bring in different levels to think of sort of local, national, international, and how we measure and manage performance. But let me start with the more general comment around general water problems. Yes, I mean, these perhaps arguably are a bigger challenge right now for industry in many places, but I don't think that they necessarily have a climate change genesis. But they do talk to that challenge of institutional capabilities and unlikely funding as well, right? Infrastructure funding. So all of this fits in together in how one thinks about competitiveness of the destination. And I take that point. I know it is a real issue for beaches, water that's coming from the municipalities can often be very, very contaminated and creates other kinds of risks. In terms of exclusivity of access, Maria, I don't know what sand parks, if they're thinking of anything yet, given that they have this major shock in terms of their infrastructure shortfall. I assume for sand parks, for Kruger infrastructure development, I haven't seen anything about pricing increases. I think they'd be quite reticent to do that, but it's hard to know what this would result in. And that, of course, I agree with you, it would be a real problem in terms of access. But it does talk to the bigger challenge of how do you think about funding for protected areas? What is the public goods case? You know, are we expecting places to be profitable? Is that even reasonable? And how complex does it get when you start looking at multiple sources of funding with different requirements, which talks a little bit to what I think, Ariel, you were referring to, which is like what M&E is needed or KPIs. I think it's a governance question, actually, because it's not just M&E, it's sort of what are we expecting of these institutions? And, you know, what are we setting up in terms of the frameworks that we then see them sit within, that we then monitor, whether it's a board, and we know that there are failures at an institutional level in some of the particularly provincial protected areas, or whether it's national government and society, and maybe that even talks to the question of access. Like, what do we privilege? Which sort of objectives do we privilege over other ones, right? So I think these protected areas function in a very complex space and try and balance things where they're trying to create income from tourism and at the same time they need to provide a whole lot of nature-based solutions and services, etc. So it's really complex. And if you look at in the paper, one of the examples of where they have local government, of course, have with a mandate in their buffer zones, the local government's trying to maximize economic development there, which sometimes is contradictory to a protected area mandate and a need to expand with climate change impacts on wildlife and vegetation. So it's not an easy space, but those adaptive partnerships I mentioned are already, I think, very creative ways of starting to think through things in practice. And maybe the only way to do this is in practice on the ground, just by starting with partnerships and pilots, etc. And then I think, I'm not sure I'm going to say, and maybe one more thing, talking to sort of how we're setting up institutions and M&E. I mean, I do think it came out quite clearly in my interviews that the PFMA is really challenging for the institutions that do protected areas management. It didn't come out as clearly in the metros with beaches, but the PFMA, and you can't roll funds. And whether it's the PFMA itself or people, institutions' ability to work within the PFMA, maybe it's a bit of both. But they are struggling with that in terms of the kind of adaptive, creative responses they need to take to climate change. It's not a flexible enough framework. So it's a big challenge for government at large, I would imagine, in the face of these disasters we can't always predict. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Kate. Akona?
Thank you to Ariel. So in terms of what would need to be done at sort of the local level, so there's something that Bangladesh is currently doing as a country that faces a vast amount of dire extreme events, which I particularly liked when I was doing the research, which is called the Cyclone Preparedness Program, where they try to sort of deal with the global south data gap by making sure that they do community-led climate data or climate monitoring, where they have more than 76,000 volunteers that go out. So those volunteers are then taught how to relay the information to people that need it the most, especially smallholder farmers, where they would tell them the information, they would relay the information in a language that they can understand. So to a bigger extent, I think that is a program that could be applied to a South African context, because when I attended the G20 last year, one of the biggest problems that came out was that everyone, when it comes to trying to solve for climate change, is solving something, but there is a divergence in terms of the definitions of what everyone is trying to solve. For instance, climate adaptation or mitigation, the definition of it is different from one country to the next, right? So we need to have a situation where we are sure what we are trying to solve for, and we can explain that in the most layman's terms type of language. And also, I think for the most part, because what Bangladesh is doing is that these people receive an alert via a megaphone, and then they go around the village alerting people on what to do. So given that South Africa we has a platforms like TikTok, we can use the youth, so we can equip the youth with sort of climate literacy in terms of what they need to say to, if, for instance, someone is telling an elderly woman that there is a level 10 red warning that is being issued by the South African Weather Services, then how do you need to act in terms of protecting your crops and whatever production or agricultural production that you have for consumption, right? So I think those are the kind of things that we need to do. To answer Alex's point, I think if you look at the last slide of my conversation of my presentation, I do talk about data interoperability, which is some of the recommendations that the Reserve Bank makes in their scenarios that you would be talking about. We are not sitting here at the end of a financial problem. We are sitting at the end of a socio-economic problem, right? So I think largely what the reports that you mentioned or that you relate to are focusing more on climate finance and how to ensure that there is ring-fenced funding that is able to deal with certain events when they happen at a faster scale than possible. So I don't think that's our part of our discussion, but we are more than happy to look into that should there be a need to do a policy brief maybe on that. Thank you.
Thanks. Gillian?
Thank you, Elise. So I did not take a deeper dive into public and private financial access for this, but I think it's very important. But from the research I did find was, especially with private finance, small-scale farmers and households are scared to go into debt, taking some of this finance and having to pay back, and would then concentrate on some of just the core activities on the farms. But there was a call, I think, in some of the associations for having favorable loans to small-scale farmers. And it goes again back to the definition of what is a small-scale farmer, because sometimes it tends to favor those who want to migrate to being a commercial farmer, who want to export and make profits. And so there's also been that issue, even in public finance, on who actually gets access to some of this public resources. And I think at the moment, with the farmers registration system going on, they're kind of trying to sort that out. But again, you know, who do you exclude? Who do you include in that? But I do think it's a very important issue and probably another deeper dive. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Gillian. Ariel, I don't know if you want to come in with any specific responses, but I will ask you to do a 1-minute closing in a few minutes, so you can prepare yourself for that. I see that there's lots happening in the chat with questions and responses. Are there any more questions that people have? You can raise your hand or put it in the chat for a response. There was a comment from Sean on Kate's presentation. Kate, I don't know if there's any specific responses to that, and I see that Michael has given extensive responses to Sean's comments. Okay, Kate?
I saw the water one. Sorry, is there another one? Maybe I'm not scrolling up or down.
Yeah,
Is it a new comment?
Yeah.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree totally. And the SJRP, Sean, that we wrote for tourism, we do try and talk about how we build communities of practice around specific issue areas, how we have local, it would have to probably be district forums between district government tourism chapters of organized business and labor, to start thinking there. And then a national framework. And I know we have so many national frameworks, but we do need organized tourism industry, organized labor, and some of the government departments, not only tourism, because in fact, a lot of the enablers of this work sit outside tourism. So, you know, presidency, treasury, transport, in terms of mitigation, and others to start talking to each other about major risks and responses. But I'm very interested in your comments. I'll try and maybe I'll follow up with you individually, because it sounds like an interesting conversation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kate. There's a question from Sibusiso, I think either to Michael or Gillian, around how we can get research tools to help farmers get funding, noting the distance between funders and farmers. Either one of you.
I'll speak to that one. I think the two big ones I mentioned was leveraging from existing infrastructure, especially with the DSI CST Innovation Survey that they already do for large-scale farmers. If this could also be adapted to small-scale farmers, but used provincially, I think if we try and do it in bite-sized, would be able to gain more ground, because then we'd have a better understanding of which farmers are there, what do they need access to? And as I said, if you think of the agricultural activities they're doing, if it's a certain part of Eastern Cape, they might need funding specifically that helps with livestock and poultry production. And also, I think, as I've said, leveraging on the current farmer registration innovation system that's ongoing, that is the only way we can definitely be able to identify the farmers and also be able to link them with some of the funding. So, but I do know the associations really are doing some work on this, but they can only get to so many as well. But those are the two major, if we're looking at it at a public level, and just trying to integrate some of the private research, international statistics, so that we also avoid double counting of who has access to which finance and those who really need it the most. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gillian. As we move to closing, I'm going to ask each of the presenters, starting with Neva, to just give a 1-minute wrap up on some of the key issues for you that have come through in doing this work and in the seminar today. Neva?
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I just want to say thanks to everybody for the comments and for the inputs. I think that, you know, what comes through is two things. Firstly, that you know, ideally, if we had a better national discussion about these issues, that we could see more clearly where this fits into our broader economic needs. So, for instance, when we talk about financing for farmers, that's a much broader question than just climate resilience. And there's actually a risk that if you try to leverage that through climate resilience, you end up putting money, because donors are happy to give money to green stuff, you end up actually diverting resources away from more immediate needs. So I think it's something where, like any other issue where we want government to put in resources, we need to be able to say, how do we engage on this in a meaningful way? And I do think that from that context, the one thing I would really like to have a broader discussion about is the Climate Change Act, which I think was largely drafted before we started working on the SJRPs, and doesn't actually talk much about the just transition in the economy as opposed to the impacts of weather changes on the economy, which is not quite the same thing. And I think thinking through how that could be accommodated better going forward would be helpful.
Thanks, Neva. Michael?
Yeah, so for me, it's just, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and some very interesting comments and some things to think about, especially going forward and trying to do a policy brief. But for me, it's just the thinking around active labor market policies and climate change as a whole, is that we need to start integrating climate change responses within, not only from a technological side, but also from a labor market perspective and social protection, especially as they relate to workers within these vulnerable sectors. And obviously, it is a massive task because every worker within these various sectors that we covered will be different. Their needs will differ. So it's just as long as we start thinking about this now and start the groundwork, I think we need to start also preparing for long-term impacts, and especially in the case of active labor market policies, which predominantly has been short-term. So we need to start thinking in the longer term, especially as it goes to climate change, it's a very complex thing. We don't know what the impacts will be, but we can at least try. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Kate?
No, just say thank you to everyone for the comments and contributions, and maybe just, I think Neva's question or comment around distraction and where we focus and sort of compounding risks are critical in all of the spaces. So maybe the point is, how do we use the climate change argument, which is very real and problematic, to bring out some of those longer standing structural issues that we face anyway, so that it is what they call climate resilient development, which is a nicely touted term, but I think people don't really know how to make it work. So the social and economic justice, the spatial or territorial basis, this institutional question, including kind of the frameworks and approaches, can maybe be grounded a bit through that. I don't know. Yeah. And then we do need to make sure the system works better, because I think my example, and I was so pleased to see these adaptive partnerships, right, that the institutions are undertaking, which is great. But you don't want to rely on creative thinking on adaptive partnerships. You want institutions to be able to deliver what they need to and respond. So that, I guess, is the big challenge, perhaps across the board a bit as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Akona?
So for me, I think it's the balancing act between trying to commercialize access to climate information and the need to solve the reality that we are in, that the climate events are intensifying and are becoming more extreme. So, right, so if there's a researcher like me that is looking for information so that they can inform some sort of evidence-based policy making, then I think it also there should be some sort of leeway in terms of access to the data that you need, and specifically if you look at smallholder farmers, right, because they sit at the lower end of the ecosystem in terms of access to climate information. So we need to think of ways that we can make them more adaptable, because also if we don't make them more adaptable to climate change, then there's also an issue of food security that leads also to poverty. So we need to find the balancing edge between trying to commercialize the information that is affecting the bulk of the population and trying to make them adapt. And I think we need to sort of think who do we want to adapt and how should they adapt if they don't have access to the information that they need. Thank you.
Thanks, Akona. Gillian?
So for me, firstly, it's bridging the gap for small-scale farmers and just the landscape and what they have access to. And I think secondly, is also expanding some of the private-public partnership for extinction officers. And then thirdly, going back to finance, just also bridging that gap between public and private finance, and just so it's also targeted towards those who need it. Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian. Ariel, any concluding comments from your side?
Just to say, this has been a very interesting deep dive, and how interesting these components of agriculture and tourism overlap. And just that it's important to, of course, look at policy and how it's transitioning, but yes, to look practically and realistically about how this is linking to the bigger problem of climate change and really looking towards the future. It's going to get bad. What are we doing now? But then also looking at how stakeholders are talking to each other, particularly for forecasting. If we don't have information, how can we act? And then, of course, particularly for Gillian's presentation of these change agents includes all aspects, and that it is a bridge, but how strong is this bridge and what does this bridge actually look like? It's been very informative, and thank you very much for this deep dive. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So thank you to our presenters and our discussant for their comments and insights, and for presenting what I thought was quite useful learnings from this project. We've gone down a road where we've now have, I think, 20 papers from this project. So we've done a lot of work. It's available on our website, and it is interesting. I've learned a lot from this project, and I hope everyone who's been joining these calls has learnt equally, and taken away some of the very real challenges, but also that there are possibilities, there are opportunities to take us forward. So thank you to all the participants who've joined in this call and in other learning event sessions, to our funders, UK government, through UK Pact and FCDO, and the partners in this, which is DFFE, who've been part of us throughout this journey on this process, and we've shared all of our research with them for them to take forward into the next steps. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon. Bye.